In the unforgiving desert town of Cedar Ridge, where harsh sunlight reveals every flaw and whispered judgments carry on the wind, appearances determine a person's worth. Here, beneath the scorching Arizona sun, lives a woman whose twisted leg has made her an outcast in her own community. Cast aside by neighbors who see only her disability, she struggles to survive with nothing but her fierce determination and wounded heart. On the outskirts of town, a weathered cowboy tends his horses in solitude, carrying scars that run deeper than the desert canyons. He's learned to live with loneliness as his only companion, building walls around his heart as sturdy as the fences. Around his ranch, when their paths cross at the town's dusty general store, something unexpected begins to bloom. But can two broken souls find healing in each other's company? Or will the town's cruel judgment tear them apart before love has a chance to take root? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered boardwalk as Sarah Mae Collins made her careful way down Main Street, her hand-carved walking stick tapping a steady rhythm against the sun-bleached planks. The stick, smooth from years of use, had been crafted by her father's loving hands 32 years ago when she'd taken her first tentative steps as a child. Made from sturdy oak and carved with delicate wildflowers along its length, it remained her most treasured possession, a tangible reminder that she had once been cherished, once been seen as perfect in someone's eyes. The early hour meant fewer prying stares, fewer whispered comments that followed her like tumbleweeds on the desert wind. Sarah had learned to time her errands carefully, slipping through town when most folks were still tending to their morning chores. Her twisted left leg, shorter than the right and bent at an unnatural angle from a difficult birth, drew attention she'd never grown comfortable with despite 3 decades of practice. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house sat at the shabby end of Main Street, its once white paint now the color of desert dust. Sarah's room on the 2nd floor was small, but clean, furnished with little more than a narrow bed, a washstand, and the precious Singer sewing machine that represented both her livelihood and her sanctuary. Through her single window she could see the distant mountains that ringed Cedar Ridge like weathered guardians, their purple peaks a stark contrast to the endless brown of the desert floor. The town itself bore the marks of a place that had seen better days. Once a bustling stop on the cattle drive routes, Cedar Ridge now survived on stubborn determination and the occasional silver strike in the nearby hills. The population hovered around 300 souls, most of whom had known each other since childhood. In a place where everyone's business was common knowledge, Sarah's disability had long ago relegated her to the margins of society. She earned her living as a seamstress, her fingers nimble and sure, despite the challenges her body presented. The intricate stitchwork that flowed from her hands was admired even by those who wouldn't spare her a kind word on the street. Wedding dresses, Sunday-best suits, and delicate christening gowns all bore the mark of her craftsmanship. Yet the women who praised her work in private would barely acknowledge her presence in public, as if kindness towards someone like her might somehow be contagious. Sarah's days followed a predictable pattern. She rose before dawn, when the desert air still held a whisper of coolness, and worked by lamplight until the sun climbed high enough to illuminate her small room. Her fingers moved with practiced precision, transforming ordinary fabric into garments that would mark life's most important moments for people who would never invite her to share in their celebrations. The isolation wore on her spirit more than she cared to admit. There had been a time in her younger years when she'd harbored dreams of companionship, perhaps even marriage. But Cedar Ridge had taught her harsh lessons about the limits of acceptance. Men looked through her as if she were made of glass, their eyes sliding past without recognition. Women treated her with a mixture of pity and discomfort, as if her condition might somehow rub off on them. On the outskirts of town, where the desert began to reclaim the land, stood a modest ranch that most folks in Cedar Ridge preferred to forget existed. The Morning Star Ranch, once a thriving operation, now served as home to a single man who seemed to prefer the company of horses to people. Jack Morrison, known to most as Dusty for reasons lost to time, had returned from his cavalry service. 15 years ago, a changed man. At 45, Jack carried himself with the straight-backed bearing of a soldier, though his blue eyes held shadows that spoke of battles fought and losses endured. His sandy hair, streaked now with silver at the temples, was kept neat despite his hermit-like existence. He stood tall and lean, his hands scarred from years of working with rope and leather, his face weathered by sun and wind into the kind of rugged handsomeness that might have turned heads in town if he'd ever given anyone the chance to look closely. Dustes ranch house itself was a testament to loneliness and neglect. Once it had been a home filled with laughter and love, but those days seemed as distant as the mountains on the horizon. 2 bedrooms stood empty, their doors kept closed against memories too painful to face. The kitchen, once the heart of a family home, now served the simple needs of a man who ate to survive rather than for pleasure. Jack's days were spent tending to his small herd of horses, the only creatures that seemed to bring him any measure of peace. He had a gift with the animals, a gentle patience that belied his gruff exterior. The horses responded to him with trust and affection, perhaps sensing in him a kindred spirit, something wounded but not broken, something capable of healing given time and care. His evenings were spent on the front porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains, while nursing a cup of coffee that had long grown cold. The silence of the desert surrounded him like a blanket, broken only by the distant call of a coyote or the soft nickering of horses in the paddock. It was a loneliness he'd chosen, built carefully around himself like a fortress against further pain. The town folk of Cedar Ridge had long ago stopped trying to draw Jack back into their community. He appeared in town only when necessity demanded, for supplies at Garrett's general store, occasional visits to the blacksmith, or the rare need for a doctor's attention. His interactions were brief and polite, but he made it clear that he preferred his solitude to their company. Both Sarah and Jack had learned to navigate the careful choreography of a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. She timed her errands to avoid the busiest hours and the cruelest tongues. He made his trips to town swift and efficient, speaking only when spoken to and avoiding the kind of lingering conversations that might invite unwanted questions about his past or his intentions for the future. The general store served as the unofficial heart of Cedar Ridge, where news was shared, gossip was traded, and the social hierarchy of the town was quietly reinforced. Old Man Garrett, who'd run the store for more than 20 years, was one of the few people who treated Sarah with consistent kindness. His wife had died young, and perhaps that loss had taught him something about the fragility of human dignity. The store's interior was a maze of shelves, packed with everything from bolts of fabric to horse tack, from patent medicines to penny candy. A brass bell mounted above the door announced each arrival with a cheerful chime that seemed to mock the less-than-cheerful receptions many customers received. The wooden floors, worn smooth by countless feet, creaked familiar warnings when anyone approached, making private conversations nearly impossible. It was here, among the everyday necessities of frontier life, that 2 wounded souls would soon discover that sometimes healing begins not with grand gestures, but with the simple recognition of shared humanity. The bell above the door would chime many times in the days to come, marking moments of connection that would challenge everything Cedar Ridge thought it knew about beauty, worth, and the capacity of the human heart to see beyond surface appearances to the truth that lay beneath. Sarah's walking stick would tap its steady rhythm across those worn floorboards, and Jack's spurs would ring softly against the wood, creating an unlikely harmony that would grow stronger with each passing day. Neither of them knew it yet, but their careful, solitary existences were about to intersect in ways that would change not only their own lives, but the very soul of a town that had forgotten how to look beyond the surface to find the beauty that dwells within. The torn wedding dress lay across Sarah's small table like a broken promise, its ivory silk catching the afternoon light streaming through her window. She'd spent 3 weeks crafting every delicate detail, hand-sewn pearls along the bodice, intricate lacework at the sleeves, and a train that would have swept majestically behind the bride as she walked down the aisle. It was the finest work she'd ever produced, commissioned by the wealthy Carmichael family for their eldest daughter's wedding to the banker's son. Sarah's fingers trembled as she examined the tier that ran from the waist to the hem, deliberately made by shaking hands when Mrs. Carmichael had arrived that morning with fire in her eyes and accusations on her tongue. The woman had burst into Sarah's small room without knocking, her face flushed with indignation and something darker, the kind of revulsion that came from discovering you'd been forced to rely on someone you considered beneath your station. "I should have known better than to trust such important work to someone like you," Mrs. Carmichael had spat, her voice carrying the venom of social superiority. "My daughter's wedding day ruined because I was foolish enough to believe you could create something beautiful. How could someone so damaged possibly understand what beauty truly means?" The words had cut deeper than any physical wound, striking at the tender places in Sarah's heart where hope still struggled to survive. She'd watched in stunned silence as Mrs. Carmichael had grabbed the dress from its careful arrangement, shaking it violently before tearing the silk with deliberate cruelty. The sound of ripping fabric had seemed to echo in the small room long after the woman had stormed out, leaving Sarah alone with the ruins of her finest work and the echo of cruel laughter drifting up from the street below. The truth, Sarah knew, was simpler and more painful than Mrs. Carmichael's dramatic performance. Someone had told the family about the seamstress who'd crafted their daughter's dress. Someone had whispered about the woman with the twisted leg, the one who lived alone, in the boarding house and kept to herself. The very thought that their precious daughter would wear something created by such hands had become unbearable to them. Sarah had worked for weeks without payment, trusting in the Carmichael family's reputation for honoring their debts. The commission would have provided enough money to last her through the winter months when sewing work grew scarce. Now she faced not only financial ruin, but the public humiliation that would surely follow. In a town the size of Cedar Ridge, news of Mrs. Carmichael's rejection would spread like wildfire through tumbleweeds. She made her way slowly down to the boarding house parlor, where Mrs. Henderson sat mending stockings by the window. The older woman looked up as Sarah entered, her expression shifting from casual interest to concern as she took in Sarah's pale face and trembling hands. "What's happened, dear?" Mrs. Henderson asked, setting aside her needlework. She was one of the few people in Cedar Ridge who'd consistently shown Sarah kindness, perhaps because she too knew what it meant to be marginalized. A widow running a boarding house was hardly considered respectable society. "The Carmichaels," Sarah managed, her voice barely above a whisper. They don't want the dress anymore." Mrs. Henderson's mouth tightened into a thin line. She'd seen enough of human nature in her 60 years to understand exactly what had transpired without needing the details spelled out. "I see," she said quietly, "and I suppose they had their reasons?" Sarah couldn't bring herself to voice the cruel words, so she simply nodded, sinking into the worn armchair across from her landlady. The late afternoon sun slanted through the lace curtains, casting intricate shadows that seemed to mock the delicate patterns Sarah had so carefully stitched into the ruined dress upstairs. By evening, the news had indeed spread throughout Cedar Ridge with the efficiency of a prairie fire. Sarah could hear the whispered conversations from her window as people gathered on the street below, their voices carrying clearly in the desert air. The story had grown in the telling, as such stories always did. Now, she wasn't just the crippled seamstress who disappointed the Carmichael family. She was the woman who'd tried to deceive good Christian folk by hiding her condition, the one who'd attempted to involve herself in decent society where she clearly didn't belong. The next morning brought fresh humiliation. Sarah needed supplies from the general store, thread for the small mending jobs that might still come her way, and food to stretch what little money she had left. She'd hoped to slip in early, before the usual crowd gathered, but fate had other plans. As she approached Garrett's general store, she could see through the windows that it was already busy with the morning's customers. Mrs. Fletcher and Mrs. Morrison stood near the fabric counter, their heads bent together in animated conversation that ceased abruptly when Sarah pushed through the door. The brass bell announced her arrival with its usual cheerful chime, but the sound seemed harsh and mocking in the sudden silence that fell over the store. "Well, if it isn't our local artist," Mrs. Fletcher said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I heard about your difficulties with the Carmichael Commission. Such a shame when folks try to reach above their station." Sarah's face burned with embarrassment, but she forced herself to walk steadily toward the counter where old Mr. Garrett waited with sympathetic eyes. She'd endured worse than sharp tongues in her 32 years, and she wouldn't give these women the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. "I need thread," she said quietly to Mr. Garrett, who nodded and began gathering the spools she indicated. Behind her, the conversation resumed in voices pitched just loud enough for her to hear every word. "I always said there was something unseemly about letting her do the important work," Mrs. Morrison declared. "A woman like that, living alone, working with her hands, it's not natural. There are reasons the Lord marks some people, and we ignore those signs at our peril." "The Carmichael girl deserves better for her special day," Mrs. Fletcher agreed. "Can you imagine the scandal if word had gotten out? People would have talked about nothing else but the crippled seamstress who made the dress. It would have overshadowed the entire ceremony." Sarah's hands shook as she counted out the coins for her purchases, but she kept her voice steady. "Thank you, Mr. Garrett," she said with as much dignity as she could muster. As she turned to leave, Mrs. Fletcher stepped deliberately into her path. "Perhaps this will teach you to know your place," she said with a smile that held no warmth. "Some of us are meant for different things in this life, and it's important to accept what the Lord has planned for us." The words followed Sarah out into the bright sunlight, where a small crowd had gathered on the boardwalk. Word of the confrontation inside had somehow preceded her exit, and faces turned toward her with expressions ranging from pity to cruel amusement. She could feel their stares like physical weight as she made her way slowly down the street, her walking stick tapping against the wooden planks with each careful step. But she wasn't alone in witnessing this public humiliation. From across the street, near the hitching post where he'd tied his horse, Jack Morrison watched the scene unfold with growing anger. He'd come to town for supplies, just as he did every few weeks, intending to complete his business quickly and return to the solitude of his ranch. Instead, he found himself transfixed by the sight of a woman facing down a crowd of people who seemed to take pleasure in her pain. Something about her dignity in the face of such cruelty stirred emotions in him that he'd thought buried forever. The way she held her head high despite the whispers, the careful grace with which she navigated both the physical challenges of her disability and the social minefield of small-town gossip, it reminded him of another time, another woman who'd faced the world's judgment with similar courage. As Sarah disappeared around the corner toward the boarding house, Jack remained where he stood, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The easy thing would be to ignore what he'd witnessed, to collect his supplies and retreat to his ranch as he always did. But something had shifted in that moment of recognition, some long, dormant instinct that told him he couldn't simply walk away and pretend he hadn't seen the cruelty of supposedly civilized people. The torn wedding dress had been more than fabric and thread. It had been a symbol of dreams deferred, of worth questioned, and of a woman's place in a society that measured value by appearances alone. But it had also been the catalyst that would bring two wounded souls into each other's orbit, setting in motion events that would challenge everything Cedar Ridge thought it knew about beauty, dignity, and the true nature of the human heart. Jack Morrison had never been a man given to impulsive decisions. His years in the cavalry had taught him the value of careful planning, of studying a situation from every angle before making a move. But as he stood in the dusty street watching Sarah May Collins disappear around the corner, something stirred in his chest that felt uncomfortably like the protective instincts he'd thought died with his family 15 years ago. That evening, he sat on his front porch as usual, but his thoughts kept drifting from the familiar solitude of his ranch to the small boarding house in town. The silver horse bridle hanging on a nail beside his door caught the last rays of sunlight, its polished metal gleaming like a reminder of the man he'd once been. He'd carried that bridle through 3 years of cavalry service, had cared for it with the same meticulous attention he'd given to every piece of his equipment. It represented discipline, honor, and the kind of respect that should be shown to anyone facing life's battles with courage. The woman, Sarah, he'd heard Mrs. Fletcher call her, had shown more grace under fire than some soldiers he'd known. The way she'd held herself steady while those harpies pecked at her dignity had reminded him of the bearing expected of a cavalry officer under enemy fire. There was steel beneath that quiet exterior, a strength that impressed him more than he cared to admit. 3 days passed before Jack found himself riding toward town again, though he couldn't quite articulate why. His supply run wasn't scheduled for another week, and his pantry was adequately stocked. Yet here he was, guiding his horse down the familiar dusty road that led to Cedar Ridge's main street, the silver bridle glinting in the morning sun as a reminder of the standards he'd once lived by. Garrett's general store seemed smaller somehow when Jack pushed through the door, the brass bell announcing his arrival to the handful of early customers browsing the shelves. His eyes swept the interior automatically, taking in the layout and occupants with the practiced assessment of a former soldier. She wasn't there, but he found himself lingering near the fabric counter anyway, studying bolts of cloth as if he had any need for such things. "Help you find something specific, Jack?" Old man Garrett appeared at his elbow, genuine friendliness in his weathered face. Garrett was one of the few people in Cedar Ridge who treated Jack's occasional visits as normal rather than noteworthy events. "Looking for some fabric," Jack heard himself say, the words surprising him as much as they seemed to surprise the storekeeper. "Need some curtains for the house." Garrett's eyebrows rose slightly, but he was too polite to comment on this sudden domestic urge from a man who'd lived like a hermit for over a decade. "Well, we've got plenty to choose from. What kind of room you fixing up?" Jack examined the bolts with more attention than they warranted, his rough fingers testing the weight and texture of various materials. He had no real idea what he was looking for, but something deep blue caught his eye, a sturdy cotton that would hold up well to desert sun and wind. "This'll do," he said, pointing to the bolt. "Good choice," Garrett agreed, beginning to measure out several yards. "Sarah May does beautiful work with curtains if you're looking for someone to sew them up proper. Best seamstress in 3 counties. That girl is. Real shame what happened with the Carmichael business." Jack's hands stilled on the counter. "What kind of shame?" Garrett's expression darkened. "Oh, you didn't hear? Mrs. Carmichael threw a fit when she found out Sarah had made her daughter's wedding dress. Tore the thing right in half, right there in the girls' room. Made quite a scene about how someone with Sarah's condition had no business touching such important work. Her condition." Jack's voice carried a dangerous edge that made Garrett look up sharply. "Well, you know, the leg. Some folks think—" Garrett trailed off, perhaps recognizing that he was discussing something that didn't sit well with his customer. "Anyway, it's a damn shame. That girl has more skill in her little finger than most of these society ladies have in their whole bodies. And she works harder than any 2 people I know." Jack paid for his fabric without another word, but Garrett's information had given him what he needed. The next morning found him back at the store, this time with a legitimate purpose. He'd torn the pocket of his work shirt on a fence post, and while he could manage basic mending, the rip was beyond his limited skills. This time, Sarah was there. She stood near the thread display, her back to the door, carefully selecting spools with the focused attention of someone who understood the importance of matching colors exactly. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun, revealing the graceful line of her neck and the careful way she balanced her weight against her walking stick. She wore a dress of deep green cotton, well made but not fancy, that brought out the auburn highlights in her hair. Jack approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. When she turned at the sound of his boots on the wooden floor, he found himself looking into eyes the color of warm honey, eyes that held wariness, but also an intelligence that seemed to take his measure in a single glance. "Miss," he said, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. His voice came out rougher than he'd intended, rusty from lack of use in social situations. "Sir?" she replied quietly, her tone polite but cautious. Up close, he could see the fine lines around her eyes that spoke of both laughter and sorrow, the slight tension in her shoulders that suggested she was prepared for whatever judgment he might pass. Jack pulled the torn shirt from his saddlebag, grateful to have a legitimate reason for the conversation. "I wonder if you might be able to fix this," he said, holding up the garment. "Caught it on some barbed wire." Sarah's eyes moved to the shirt, then back to his face, searching for signs of mockery or pity. Finding neither, she took the garment and examined the tear with professional interest. Her fingers were long and graceful, he noticed, with the slightly calloused tips that spoke of countless hours spent with needle and thread. "It's a clean tear," she said after a moment. "Should mend up just fine. I could reinforce it so it won't happen again." "I'd appreciate that," Jack said. "How long would it take?" "A few days. I have some other work ahead of it." She named a fair price, neither inflated nor suspiciously low. "That's fine," Jack agreed. "I'm Jack Morrison, from the Morning Star Ranch." "Sarah Collins," she replied, then seemed to hesitate before adding, "I know who you are. Most folks do." There was no judgment in her tone, just a simple statement of fact. In a town the size of Cedar Ridge, everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. Jack wondered what stories she'd heard about the hermit rancher, what explanations people had invented for his self-imposed isolation. "I'll have it ready by Thursday," Sarah said, carefully folding the shirt. "You can pick it up here, or if it's more convenient, I could bring it out to your place." The offer surprised him. Most people seemed happy to have as little contact with him as possible. "Here's fine," he said quickly, then found himself adding, "Thank you, Miss Collins. I appreciate quality work." Something flickered in her eyes at the compliment. Surprise, perhaps, or the kind of pleasure that comes from having one's efforts recognized. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison." Jack touched his hat brim again and made his way toward the door, acutely aware that other customers in the store had taken note of the exchange. Let them talk, he thought. He'd endured worse than small-town gossip. As he stepped back out into the bright sunlight, Jack realized that for the first time in years, he was actually looking forward to Thursday. Thursday came, with the kind of crystalline desert morning that made the mountains look close enough to touch. Jack found himself checking his pocket watch more often than usual as he went about his morning chores, feeding the horses and mending a section of fence that didn't really need his immediate attention. By the time he'd justified the trip to town, the sun had climbed high enough to cast short shadows beneath the mesquite trees that dotted his property. Sarah had his shirt ready when he arrived at the general store, wrapped carefully in brown paper and tied with string. Her repair work was masterful. Not only had she mended the tear so skillfully that it was nearly invisible, but she'd reinforced the seams at stress points and even replaced a button that had been hanging loose. It was the kind of thoughtful attention to detail that spoke of pride in one's craft. "This is fine work," Jack said, examining the shirt with genuine appreciation. Better than it was when I bought it new." A flush of pleasure crossed Sarah's features, though she tried to hide it behind professional composure. "I like to do things properly," she said simply. Jack paid her fee and added a small tip that she initially tried to refuse, though he insisted, with quiet stubbornness. As he prepared to leave, he found himself hesitating, words forming in his mind that he wasn't sure he had the courage to speak. "Miss Collins," he said finally, "I don't suppose you'd be interested in some additional work. I've got curtains that need making and some other mending that's been piling up." Sarah's eyes searched his face, perhaps wondering if this was charity disguised as commerce. "What kind of curtains?" "Kitchen windows, mainly. Maybe the front room." Jack pulled out the blue fabric he'd purchased. "Already got the material." She fingered the cotton appreciatively, testing its weight and weave. "It's good quality cloth. How many windows?" "4 in the kitchen, 2 large ones in the front room." Jack found himself adding details he hadn't planned to share. "The house has been neglected. Could use a woman's touch to make it feel like a home again." Something in his tone must have conveyed more than he intended, because Sarah's expression softened. "I could come out and take measurements," she offered. "See what you need." "I'd appreciate that," Jack said, surprised by how much he meant it. "When would be convenient?" "Saturday morning, if the weather holds." "Saturday's fine." Jack touched his hat brim in farewell, already anticipating the visit with an emotion he couldn't quite name. That evening, Sarah sat at her small table by the window, writing in her leather-bound journal by lamplight. She'd kept the diary since her teenage years, recording her thoughts and observations about the people and events that shaped her solitary existence. Tonight, she found herself struggling to capture her impressions of the quiet rancher who'd shown her such unexpected courtesy. "Mr. Morrison is not what I expected," she wrote in her careful script. "People call him a hermit, but there's nothing antisocial about his manner. He speaks little, but when he does, his words carry weight. There's sadness in him. I can see it in the way he holds himself, as if he's carrying some invisible burden. But there's also kindness, the sort that doesn't call attention to itself." She paused, her pen hovering over the page as she considered her next words. "I find myself curious about his story, though I know better than most how painful it can be when people pry into matters that are meant to remain private. Perhaps that's why his courtesy means so much. He treats me as a person first, not as an object of pity or curiosity." Saturday dawned clear and warm, with the kind of gentle breeze that made riding pleasant rather than a chore. Jack had spent Friday evening cleaning his house with an attention to detail that would have amazed anyone who'd seen his usual housekeeping habits. Not that the place was dirty. He was too much of a soldier to live in actual squalor, but he'd never bothered with the small touches that made a house feel welcoming. Sarah arrived promptly at 9 o'clock, riding in Tom Garrett's wagon. The old storekeeper had offered to drive her out, both as a kindness and because he was curious about Jack's sudden domestic interests. He helped Sarah down from the wagon and carried her sewing basket, though she insisted on managing her walking. "Stick herself. I'll be back in a couple hours," Tom called as he prepared to leave. "That enough time for measuring?" "Plenty," Sarah assured him, though Jack found himself wishing the old man had offered to return later in the day. The house surprised Sarah with its solid construction and good proportions. It was clearly built to shelter a family, with large rooms and wide windows that let in abundant light. But it felt hollow somehow, as if the walls were waiting for voices and laughter to bring them back to life. Jack led her through the rooms with visible discomfort, perhaps seeing the emptiness through her eyes. The kitchen was functional, but sterile, lacking the small touches that marked a space where meals were prepared with love rather than mere necessity. The front room was dominated by a large stone fireplace, but the furniture was arranged with military precision rather than comfort in mind. "You're right about needing curtains," Sarah said as she began taking measurements. "These windows are beautiful, but they'd benefit from some softening." Jack watched as she worked, noting the efficient way she moved despite her disability, and The careful attention she paid to each detail. She measured twice and made precise notations in a small notebook, occasionally asking questions about his preferences for length and fullness. "I was thinking about getting some furniture," Jack said suddenly, the words seeming to surprise him as much as her. "Maybe a proper table for the kitchen, some comfortable chairs for the front room. The place has been more like a barracks than a home." Sarah paused in her measuring to look at him directly. "What changed your mind?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications that neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Jack was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving around the empty room, as if seeing it for the first time. "Maybe I got tired of living like a ghost," he said finally. "Maybe it's time to remember that I'm still alive." The honesty in his voice made Sarah's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. She'd spent so many years feeling like a ghost herself, moving through a world that seemed determined to look right through her. "I think that's a fine idea, Mr. Morrison," she said softly. "Jack," he corrected, "if you're going to be working here, might as well use my given name." "Jack," she repeated, testing the name on her tongue. "And I'm Sarah." When Tom Garrett returned to collect her, he found them on the front porch, sharing coffee and discussing fabric choices with the easy conversation of old friends. Something had shifted between them during those few hours. Some barrier had been lowered just enough to let possibility creep in. As the wagon pulled away from the ranch, Sarah found herself looking back at the figure standing on the porch. One hand raised in farewell. For the first time in years, she was looking forward to returning to a place that felt like it might, with time and care, become something like home. The wooden music box sat on Jack's kitchen table like a silent accusation. Its once bright paint faded and its delicate mechanism broken beyond his ability to repair. He'd discovered it while cleaning out a trunk in preparation for Sarah's return. Visit, and the sight of it had nearly brought him to his knees with the force of memory it carried. Elena had treasured the little box, winding it each evening to hear the soft melody that accompanied the tiny dancing figure inside. She'd brought it with her from her childhood home in Mexico, one of the few possessions she'd managed to carry when her family had fled north during the Revolution. It played a lullaby her grandmother had sung to her, and she'd planned to pass it down to their children someday. But there had been no children, and Elena had been gone for 15 years, and the music box had sat silent in its trunk, like everything else from their life together. Now, as Jack waited for Sarah to arrive with the finished curtains, he found himself wondering if some things were meant to be repaired rather than buried. Sarah arrived precisely on time, as had become her custom. Over the past 3 weeks, she'd made several trips to the ranch, bringing completed curtains and staying to help Jack arrange his newly purchased furniture. What had begun as a professional relationship had evolved into something that felt suspiciously like friendship, though neither of them had been bold enough to name it as such. "The kitchen looks wonderful," Sarah said as she entered, admiring the way the blue curtains softened the harsh desert light streaming through the windows. The new oak table and chairs gave the room a warmth it had lacked, and the curtains completed the transformation from sterile space to welcoming heart of a home. "Thanks to you," Jack replied, helping her remove her light shawl. He'd grown comfortable with these small courtesies, the natural gestures of hospitality that had lain dormant for so many years. "Coffee's fresh if you'd like some." As Sarah settled into one of the new chairs, her gaze fell on the music box. She recognized immediately that it was something precious, something that carried weight beyond its simple construction. The pain that flickered across Jack's features when he followed her gaze told her the rest of the story. "It's beautiful," she said softly, making no move to touch it without permission. Jack was quiet for a long moment, his fingers wrapped around his coffee cup as if anchoring himself to the present. "It was my wife's," he said finally, "Elena's. She died 15 years ago, along with our baby daughter. Influenza took them both in the space of a week." Sarah's heart clenched at the raw grief still evident in his voice after all these years. She understood now the shadows she'd glimpsed. Behind his careful courtesy, the careful way he'd arranged his life to avoid the risk of such loss again. "I'm so sorry," she said, the words feeling inadequate but heartfelt. "The music box broke a few years after she died," Jack continued, his eyes fixed on the silent trinket. "I never could bring myself to fix it, but I couldn't throw it away either. Seemed like admitting they were really gone." Sarah studied the delicate mechanism visible through the open lid, her trained eye assessing the damage. "What's wrong with it?" "Spring's broken, I think, and something's come loose inside. It used to play the prettiest melody." Jack's voice trailed off, lost in memories of evenings when that soft music had filled their home with hope for the future. "I might be able to fix it," Sarah said carefully, not wanting to promise something she couldn't deliver. "I've worked on clock mechanisms before, when folks needed them repaired. The principles are similar." Jack looked up sharply, hope and fear warring in his expression. "You'd do that? If you'd like me to try. I can't promise anything, but I could take a look." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of trust being offered and considered. Finally, Jack reached across the table and gently pushed the music box toward her. "She used to wind it every night," he said quietly. Said the music helped her sleep peacefully. Sarah accepted the fragile treasure with reverence, understanding that she was being entrusted with more than a broken toy. This represented Jack's willingness to risk hope again, to believe that broken things might be made whole. Over the following days, Sarah worked on the music box in the quiet hours after her regular sewing was finished. The mechanism was indeed delicate, its tiny gears and springs requiring patience and precision to repair. She cleaned each component carefully, replaced the broken spring with one she fashioned herself, and gradually coaxed the little dancer back to life. But it was more than mechanical work that occupied her time. As she labored over the intricate repairs, she found herself thinking about Jack's story, about the man who'd loved so deeply, that losing that love had driven him into 15 years of isolation. She thought about Elena, a woman she'd never met, but who felt real in the stories Jack had begun to share during their coffee conversations. She had a withered arm, Jack had told her one afternoon, the words coming slowly as if he was testing their weight. From childhood polio. Couldn't use her left hand properly, but it never slowed her down. She was the strongest person I ever knew. The revelation had stopped Sarah's breath for a moment, understanding dawning like sunrise over the desert. No wonder Jack had shown her such natural courtesy, such easy acceptance of her own disability. He'd loved someone who faced the world's judgment with grace and determination, someone who'd proven that physical limitations had no bearing on the depth of a person's heart. What was she like? Sarah had asked, genuinely curious about the woman who'd captured this quiet man's devotion. Jack's eyes had grown distant, but peacefully so. Beautiful. Not just to look at, though she was that too. Beautiful in the way she saw the world. She found joy in small things, a perfect sunset, a wildflower blooming where you'd least expect it, the sound of rain on the roof. She taught me to notice things I'd walked past my whole life without seeing. Now, as Sarah worked to restore Elena's music box, she felt a strange kinship with the woman, whose memory still shaped Jack's days. They'd both faced a world that judged them by their limitations rather than their strengths. Both found ways to create beauty despite the obstacles placed in their paths. When the repairs were finally complete, Sarah wound the tiny key with trembling fingers. The melody that emerged was indeed beautiful, a haunting lullaby that spoke of love and loss and the enduring hope that connects one generation to the next. The little dancer spun gracefully on her pedestal, as if she'd never stopped moving, as if the years of silence had been only a brief pause in an eternal dance. Sarah carried the restored music box to the ranch on a Tuesday morning when the desert air was sweet with the scent of blooming sage. She found Jack in the corral, working with a young horse that showed promise as a riding mount. He looked up as she approached, and something in her expression must have told him that she brought good news. "Did you?" he began, hardly daring. to hope. Instead of answering with words, Sarah wound the music box and let Elena's lullaby fill the morning air. Jack's face transformed as the familiar melody washed over him, 15 years of carefully guarded grief giving way to something that looked almost like peace. For a long moment, they stood listening to the sweet music, each lost in their own thoughts about healing and hope and the unexpected ways that broken things could be made beautiful again. The hand-forged horseshoe gleamed in the forge's orange glow as Jack shaped the final curve with practiced blows of his hammer. He'd learned blacksmithing during his cavalry years, a skill that served him well on the isolated ranch where professional help was days away. But this particular horseshoe was different from the utilitarian pieces he usually crafted for his horses. This one was meant for Sarah. He'd been working on it for 3 days, taking unusual care with each detail. The iron was polished smooth, the curve perfectly balanced, and he'd added small decorative elements along the rim. Tiny wildflowers that reminded him of the ones Elena used to gather, the same ones that grew wild around Sarah's favorite spot. By the creek, where they'd taken to meeting for their afternoon conversations. The idea had come to him after watching Sarah navigate the rocky path to the creek, her walking stick sometimes slipping on the loose stones. A horseshoe was traditionally a symbol of luck and protection, and while he couldn't protect her from the cruelty of small-minded people, perhaps he could offer her something that represented his growing desire to shield her from whatever harm. He could. Their relationship had deepened considerably since the restoration of Elena's music box. Sarah now visited the ranch twice a week, officially to help with various domestic projects, but increasingly simply for the pleasure of each other's company. They'd fallen into comfortable rhythms. She would arrive in the late morning, they'd work together on whatever household task needed attention, share a simple lunch, and then walk down to the creek where cottonwood trees provided shade, and the sound of moving water created a peaceful backdrop for conversation. It was during these talks that Jack had learned more about Sarah's past, stories shared tentatively at first and then with growing trust. She told him about her childhood, about parents who'd loved her despite their fears for her future, about the father who'd carved her walking stick with such patience and care. She'd spoken of their deaths when she was 19, leaving her, alone in a world that seemed to have no place for someone like her. "I thought about leaving Cedar Ridge after they died," she'd confided one afternoon, her fingers trailing in the cool creek water. "Going somewhere bigger, where nobody knew my story. But this was home, you know? Even with all its troubles, it was the only place that held memories of being loved." Jack had understood that sentiment more than she could know. He'd stayed on the ranch for similar reasons, surrounded by echoes of the life he'd built with Elena. The difference was that his isolation had been self-imposed, while Sarah's had been forced upon her by a community that should have embraced one of its own. The harassment had escalated in recent weeks. Someone had thrown rocks at Sarah's window 3 nights running, leaving spiderweb cracks in the glass that Mrs. Henderson couldn't afford to replace. Cruel notes had appeared under her door, anonymous messages that questioned her right to decent treatment and suggested she should accept her station with more humility. The general consensus in Cedar Ridge seemed to be that Sarah was getting above herself by spending time at the Morrison Ranch, and certain elements of the community were determined to remind her of her place. Jack's anger at these incidents burned steady and cold, the kind of rage that had made him effective in battle but dangerous to those who threatened what he protected. He'd offered to confront the perpetrators directly, but Sarah had asked him not to, fearing that his interference would only make things worse for her when he wasn't around to help. "I've lived with this all my life," she'd said with weary acceptance. "You can't fight the whole town for me, Jack." But watching her try to hide the hurt these attacks caused, seeing the way she sometimes flinched at unexpected sounds or glanced nervously over her shoulder when walking through town, made Jack's protective instincts flare with increasing intensity. He found himself wanting to gather her close, to promise that no one would ever hurt her again, to offer her the sanctuary of his name and his protection in the most permanent way possible. These feelings frightened him almost as much as they comforted him. He'd sworn after Elena's death that he would never again risk the kind of devastating loss that came with loving someone completely. The ranch, the horses, the careful solitude he'd constructed, all of it was designed to prevent exactly the kind of vulnerability that was growing in his heart, like desert wildflowers after rain. Sarah, for her part, was fighting her own battle, with hope and fear. She'd never expected to inspire affection in anyone, had long ago resigned herself to a life of solitary dignity. Jack's friendship had been gift enough, more human connection than she'd dreamed possible. But lately, she'd begun to sense something deeper in his careful courtesies, something that made her heart race with possibilities she'd never dared to consider. The afternoon he presented her with the horseshoe, they were sitting by the creek. After a morning spent hanging new curtains in his bedroom, a task that had felt strangely intimate, as if she were truly making herself at home in his space. The horseshoe was wrapped in soft leather, and Sarah's eyes widened as she uncovered the beautiful metalwork. "It's for protection," Jack said quietly, his calloused fingers gentle as he traced the decorative flowers he'd hammered into the iron. "I know it might seem like an old-fashioned notion, but where I come from, a horseshoe over the door means the people inside are watched over." Sarah turned the horseshoe in her hands, marveling at the craftsmanship and the thought behind it. "You made this for me?" "Seemed like you could use some watching over," Jack said, his voice gruff with emotion he was trying to contain. "Somebody ought to be looking out for you." The weight of the iron in her hands felt like the weight of his caring, solid and real, and more precious than anything she'd ever been given. "Jack," she said softly, "you don't have to protect me. I've been taking care of myself for a long time." "Maybe," he said, finally meeting her eyes, "but maybe you shouldn't have to anymore." The words hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross, but the horseshoe remained in Sarah's hands, tangible proof that someone cared enough to forge protection for her with his own two hands. That evening, she hung it above the door of her small room at the boarding house, and for the first time in years, she felt truly safe when she closed her eyes to sleep. Jack lay awake on his ranch, staring at the ceiling and listening to the desert wind, trying to reconcile his growing love for Sarah with his fear of losing her. The horseshoe had been a beginning, a way of declaring his intentions without fully committing to them. But he knew that such halfway measures couldn't last forever. Soon he would have to choose between the safety of his solitude and the terrifying, wonderful risk of opening his heart completely to love again. In the darkness, Eleanor's music box sat silent on his dresser, but Jack could almost hear its melody in the wind, as if his first love were giving him permission to find happiness again. The thought both comforted and terrified him, because he was beginning to understand that with Sarah it might already be too late to protect himself from the very vulnerability he'd spent 15 years trying to avoid. The faded photograph fell from between the pages of an old cavalry manual as Sarah was organizing Jack's bookshelf, fluttering to the floor like a leaf detached from its branch. She bent to retrieve it, intending to simply return it to its hiding place, but the image stopped her breath in her throat. The woman in the photograph was beautiful in the way that speaks to the soul rather than the eye. Dark hair swept back to reveal a face lit with joy and intelligence, her smile radiant despite the careful way she held her left arm close to her body. She wore a simple white dress, and beside her stood a younger version of Jack, his face open and unguarded in a way Sarah had never seen, his eyes full of the kind of love that transforms a man completely. But it was the woman's arm that made Sarah's world tilt on its axis. The left sleeve of the dress was shorter than the right, tailored to accommodate an arm that ended just below the elbow. The withered limb that Jack had mentioned, but that Sarah had never fully understood until this moment. Elena hadn't simply had limited use of her hand, as Sarah had imagined. She'd been missing most of her arm entirely. Sarah sank into Jack's reading chair, the photograph trembling in her hands as the implications crashed over her like a flash flood in the desert. Every kindness Jack had shown her, every moment of easy acceptance, every conversation in which he'd seemed to understand her struggles without explanation, had it all been born not from genuine affection, but from memory? Was she nothing more than a living reminder of the woman he'd lost? The sound of Jack's boots on the front porch sent panic racing through her veins. She started to shove the photograph back into the book, but her shaking hands fumbled the movement, and the image remained clutched against her chest when Jack entered the room. "Sarah, I thought I heard—" He stopped mid-sentence when he saw her face, his gaze immediately dropping to the photograph she held. The color drained from his features as if she'd struck him. "Where did you find that?" "It fell out of your book," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "I wasn't snooping, I was just—" "It's all right," Jack said quickly, but his tone carried a strain that made her heart ache. He moved toward her slowly, as if approaching a wounded animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. "Sarah, let me explain. Is this why?" The words burst from her before she could stop them, raw with pain and confusion. "Is this why you've been so kind to me? Because I remind you of her?" Jack's face went through a series of expressions: shock, understanding, and then something that might have been grief. "No," he said firmly, reaching for her hands. "Sarah, no, that's not—" But Sarah was already pulling away, struggling to her feet with her walking stick clutched like a shield between them. "She had no arm," she said, her voice rising with emotion she could no longer contain. "No arm, Jack. And here I am with my twisted leg, and you saw me as some kind of replacement, didn't you? Someone broken enough to remind you of what you'd lost." "That's not true," Jack said desperately, following as she moved toward the door. "Sarah, please, let me explain what really happened." "I should have known," Sarah continued, her voice breaking as 15 years of carefully constructed self-protection crumbled around her. "I should have known that someone like you couldn't actually, not for me, not for who I really am." She was at the door now, Jack's voice calling after her, but all she could hear was the roaring in her ears, the sound of her own foolish heart breaking as it realized how thoroughly she'd deceived herself. She'd thought Jack saw her as beautiful, as worthy of love, but now she understood that he'd only seen Elena's ghost wearing her face. The walk back to town felt endless, each step on her walking stick echoing like a judgment against her stupidity. How could she have believed, even for a moment, that she was anything more than a convenient substitute for the woman Jack had truly loved? All those conversations about Elena, all his gentle questions about Sarah's struggles with her disability, he'd been comparing them the entire time, measuring her against the memory of his dead wife. Mrs. Henderson took one look at Sarah's tear-streaked face and asked no questions, simply helping her up to her room and bringing tea that grew cold while Sarah stared out her window at the desert beyond. The horseshoe Jack had made for her hung above her door, but now it seemed to mock her with its promise of protection. What did she need protection from, if not her own foolish heart? Jack, meanwhile, stood in his empty kitchen holding the photograph that had destroyed everything in the space of a few devastating moments. Elena smiled up at him from the image, and for the first time since her death he felt angry at her memory. Not for dying, he'd never blamed her for that, but for the way her love had shaped him so completely that even 15 years later, he couldn't convince another woman that his feelings for her were real and separate and entirely her own. The truth was so much more complicated than Sarah's wounded imagination had allowed her to believe. Yes, Elena's disability had taught him to see past physical limitations, but that wasn't why he'd fallen in love with Sarah. Elena had been fire and light, quick to laugh and quicker to anger, passionate about everything from politics to poetry. Sarah was different, quieter, more thoughtful, her strength like deep water rather than flame. He'd fallen in love with Sarah's fierce independence, her refusal to accept pity, the way she could make him laugh with her dry observations about human nature. He loved the careful way she considered her words before speaking, the gentleness in her hands when she worked, the surprising steel in her spine when she faced down the town's cruelty. She was nothing like Elena, except in the courage it took to face a world that judged her unfairly, and Jack had been fool enough to think that comparison was a compliment. That evening he rode into town, but Mrs. Henderson met him at the boarding house door with a firm shake of her head. "She doesn't want to see you," the older woman said, not unkindly but with finality. "Maybe it's best to give her some time." "I need to explain," Jack said desperately. "She misunderstood what she saw." "Did she?" Mrs. Henderson's eyes were shrewd as she studied his face. "Because from where I sit, it looks like you've got some figuring out to do yourself. That girl's heart is broken, Mr. Morrison, and intentions don't matter much when someone's bleeding." Jack returned to his ranch that night, feeling more alone than he had since Elena's death. The house that Sarah had helped him transform into a home now felt hollow again. The curtains she'd sewn and the furniture they'd chosen together, serving only as reminders of what he'd lost through his own failure to understand how the past could poison the present. For 3 days, he tried to work out what he would say to Sarah when she finally agreed to see him. He rehearsed explanations and apologies, but every word felt inadequate to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. How could he convince her that his love was real when he wasn't entirely sure himself where Eleanor's memory ended and Sarah's? Reality began. The photograph remained on his kitchen table, Elena's face a constant reminder of the woman who'd taught him how to love, but whose memory might have cost him the chance to love again. For the first time since her death, Jack found himself wishing he could let Elena go completely, could love Sarah with a heart unencumbered by ghosts. But 15 years of grief couldn't be undone in a moment of recognition, and Jack began to fear that his inability to fully release the past might have destroyed his hopes for the future. Sarah, isolated in her small room, stared at the horseshoe above her door and wondered if protection was really what she needed, or if what she required was the strength to accept that some dreams were too beautiful to be real. The photograph had shown her a truth she'd been too hopeful to see, that she was living in the shadow of a love so profound that even death couldn't diminish it. How could she compete with a ghost, especially one who'd suffered as she suffered, but had been blessed with the kind of love that Sarah had never dared to dream possible? In the growing darkness of her room, Sarah began to understand that sometimes the cruelest wounds were inflicted not by enemies, but by the people who meant to love you and simply didn't know how. The golden wedding ring had circled Jack's finger. For 20 years, 5 years of marriage to Elena and 15 years of widowhood that followed, it had become so much a part of him that he sometimes forgot it was there, this symbol of a love that had shaped every day since Elena's death. But now, sitting in the cemetery where she rested beneath a simple granite headstone, Jack stared down at the worn band and knew that the time had come to make a choice that would define the rest of his life. 5 days had passed since Sarah had discovered Elena's photograph. 5 days during which Jack had barely slept and eaten even less. The silence of his ranch, once a comfort, now felt oppressive, filled with the echo of Sarah's wounded voice and the memory of the devastation in her eyes when she'd realized what Elena's photograph represented. He'd made 3 attempts to see her, but Mrs. Henderson had turned him away each time with the gentle firmness of a woman protecting someone she'd grown to love. "She's not ready," the boarding house keeper had said on his last visit. "Maybe she'll never be ready, Mr. Morrison." "That's a chance you'll have to take." The cemetery was quiet in the late afternoon sun, with only the sound of wind through the grass and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Jack had avoided this place for months at a time, finding his conversations with Eleanor's memory more natural at the ranch, where they'd built their life together. But today, he needed the finality of her grave, the physical reminder that she was gone and he was still here, still capable of making choices that honored both her memory and his own need to live. "I loved her, Eleanor," he said aloud, his voice carried away by the desert wind. "I never meant for it to happen, but I fell in love with Sarah May Collins, and now she thinks it's all about you. Thinks I can't tell the difference between the two of you." He pulled the ring from his finger, holding it up to catch the last rays of sunlight. The gold was worn smooth from years of wear, polished by countless unconscious touches when he'd needed comfort or reassurance. Elena had chosen this ring herself from a catalogue, saving her small earnings as a seamstress to buy it as a wedding gift for him, a symbol of her commitment to their partnership that she'd insisted on providing herself. "She's different from you," Jack continued, his eyes fixed on the headstone that bore Elena's name and the dates that bracketed her too short life. "Quieter, more careful with her words. She doesn't have your fire, your quick temper, your way of laughing at everything. But she has her own kind of strength, her own way of seeing beauty in the world. And I love her for who she is, not because she reminds me of you." A hawk cried overhead, and Jack looked up to see the bird circling in the endless blue of the desert sky. Elena had loved hawks, had seen them as symbols of freedom and grace, despite their predatory nature. She would have told him that love wasn't diminished by being shared, that hearts were capable of holding more than one great affection without lessening either. "I need to let you go," Jack whispered, the words catching in his throat. "Not forget you, I could never do that. But I need to love her without your ghost standing between us. I need to take this ring off and mean it." He sat in the growing twilight, the ring warm in his palm, thinking about the man he'd been when Elena was alive and the man he'd become in the years since her death. That younger Jack had been open to possibilities, ready to embrace love and all its risks. The man he'd become had been careful, controlled, afraid to invest too deeply in anything that could be lost. Sarah had changed that without his even realizing it. Somewhere between their first tentative conversation and their walks by the creek, somewhere between watching her work with focused concentration and seeing her face light up when she laughed at one of his rare jokes, he'd become invested again. He'd begun to hope again. And perhaps that was why Elena's photograph had been so devastating, not because it proved his feelings for Sarah were false, but because it forced him to confront how real those feelings had become. Meanwhile, across town, in her small room, Sarah was preparing for what she'd decided would be her final appearance at Cedar Ridge's Harvest Festival. The annual celebration was scheduled for the following Saturday, and tradition demanded that the entire community gather in the town square for an evening of music, dancing, and the kind of forced sociability that small towns use to paper over their internal conflicts. Sarah had attended the festival exactly once in her adult life, 3 years ago, when Mrs. Henderson had convinced her to accompany her to hear the traveling musicians who'd been hired for the occasion. The evening had been a study in careful isolation. People had been polite but distant, including her in conversations only when courtesy demanded it, their eyes sliding past her as if she were a piece of furniture that had somehow learned to walk. This year would be different. This year she would attend as a declaration of her own worth, her own right to exist in the community where she'd been born and raised. She would wear the finest dress she'd ever made for herself, would hold her head high despite the whispers and stares, and would prove to herself and everyone else that she was more than the sum of their judgments. The dress was a deep blue silk that she'd purchased with money saved over months of careful economy. She'd worked on it in the evenings by lamplight, creating a design that flattered her figure while accommodating the practical needs of someone who walked with assistance. The neckline was modest but elegant, the sleeves long and graceful, and the skirt cut in a way that moved beautifully despite her uneven gait. More importantly, it was the first dress she'd ever made with the conscious intention of looking beautiful. For 32 years, she'd dressed for practicality and invisibility, choosing colors and styles that wouldn't draw attention to her limitations. But this dress was different. This dress announced that she had the right to be seen, to be admired, to take up space in the world with confidence and grace. As she worked on the final details, tiny pearl buttons that caught the light, delicate, embroidery at the cuffs, a hemline that showed just enough of her boots to make walking manageable. Sarah found herself thinking not about Jack's betrayal, but about her own capacity for courage. She'd spent so many years accepting other people's assessments of her worth that she'd forgotten to form her own opinion. The truth was that she was skilled, intelligent, and stronger than most people gave her credit for. She'd survived the loss of her parents, years of social isolation, and the recent heartbreak of discovering that the first man to show her genuine affection might have been loving someone else's memory. If she could survive all of that, she could certainly survive one evening of being herself in public, regardless of how the town chose to react. Jack spent the days leading up to the festival in a state of restless energy that his horses found unsettling. He cleaned every piece of tack on the ranch, repaired fences that didn't need repairing, and generally worked himself to exhaustion in an attempt to quiet the voices in his head that whispered competing advice. One voice, the one that sounded like the commanding officer he'd once been, told him to let Sarah go, to accept that he'd damaged something too fragile to repair and retreat to the safety of his solitary existence. Another voice, this one sounding suspiciously like Elena at her most practical, suggested that love was worth fighting for, that real devotion required the courage to be vulnerable even when the outcome was uncertain. On Friday evening, the night before the festival, Jack made his decision. He would attend the celebration for the first time since Eleanor's death, not to force a confrontation with Sarah, but to show the entire community that he stood with her, regardless of their opinion. If she would have him, he would publicly declare his love and his intention to protect her from anyone who sought to harm her. If she wouldn't, at least she would know that someone believed she deserved better than the treatment Cedar Ridge had given her. He spent that evening cleaning his best clothes and polishing his boots, preparing for battle in the way soldiers always had, with attention to detail and quiet determination. The ring lay on his dresser, catching the lamplight like a promise he was finally ready to keep. Tomorrow he would put the past where it belonged and step forward into whatever future Sarah was willing to share with him. In her room across town, Sarah made her own preparations with the same careful attention to detail. She arranged her hair in a style that emphasized the graceful line of her neck, selected jewelry that complemented her dress without overwhelming it, and practiced walking in a way that showcased confidence rather than apology. Both of them lay awake that night, staring at their respective ceilings and thinking about the courage it would take to face a community that had spent years teaching them to know their places. Neither knew that the other would be there, but both had decided that some things were worth the risk of public judgment. Tomorrow, Cedar Ridge would see them as they truly were, and the town's reaction would determine whether their future lay together or apart. The harvest moon rose full and bright over the desert, casting silver light through Sarah's window and across Jack's ranch, blessing two hearts that were finally ready to choose love over fear, hope over resignation, and the uncertain promise of tomorrow over the safe emptiness of yesterday. The blue silk dress shimmered in the lamplight as Sarah made her final adjustments, smoothing the fabric over her hips and checking that the hemline fell exactly where she'd planned. She'd never owned anything so beautiful, had never dared to create something so deliberately calculated to catch the eye and hold it. The deep blue brought out the golden flecks in her brown eyes and complemented the auburn highlights in her carefully arranged hair. It was the dress of a woman who knew her own worth, who refused to apologize for taking up space in the world. Sarah had worked on this gown for weeks, pouring all her skill and years of suppressed longing into every stitch. The bodice fit her perfectly, emphasizing her natural curves while maintaining the modesty expected in Cedar Ridge. The sleeves were long and elegant, tapering to points that covered her hands, and drew attention to the graceful way she moved them when she spoke. Most importantly, the skirt was cut to move beautifully with her uneven gait, transforming what she'd always seen as a flaw into something that looked almost like a dancer's purposeful rhythm. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway of Sarah's room, her weathered face soft with affection and pride. "Oh, my dear," she whispered, pressing her hands to her heart. "You look absolutely radiant." "Do I look like I belong there?" Sarah asked, her voice betraying the nervousness she was trying so hard to hide. "Like I have the right to be seen?" "You look like a queen," Mrs. Henderson said firmly, "and anyone who can't see that is blind with their own foolishness." The walk to the town square took longer than usual, partly because Sarah was being more careful than normal in her finery, but mostly because word of her approach spread ahead of her like ripples in a pond. By the time she reached the edge of the celebration, a subtle but noticeable change had come over the crowd. Conversations became more hushed, heads turned in her direction, and the easy laughter of the evening took on a forced quality that suggested people were very aware of her presence. The town square had been transformed for the Harvest Festival, with lanterns strung between the buildings and a small wooden platform erected for the musicians, who would provide entertainment throughout the evening. Tables groaned under the weight of donated food, and couples were already beginning to gather near the platform in anticipation of the dancing that would follow the communal meal. Sarah paused at the edge of the square, her walking stick planted. Firmly in the packed earth, her chin raised in unconscious defiance of the stares that followed her movement. She'd known this moment would be difficult, but the reality of standing alone while an entire community observed her, every breath was more challenging than she'd anticipated. Then the crowd began to part, creating a clear path from where she stood to the heart of the celebration, and Sarah realized that her entrance had become a spectacle in itself. She could feel the weight of every gaze, could hear the whispered comments that weren't quite quiet enough to miss entirely. "Well, I never..." Bold as brass, that one. "Who does she think she is?" But there were other voices too, quieter but no. "Less significant, good for her. She looks lovely. About time someone showed some backbone around here." Sarah began to walk forward, her steps measured and deliberate. The silk of her dress caught the lantern light with each movement, and she could see her reflection in the windows of the buildings that surrounded the square. A woman in blue silk, who looked confident and beautiful and entirely unashamed of her presence in this place. Halfway across the square, she became aware of a stirring at the opposite edge of the crowd, a different kind of attention that drew eyes away from her to focus on something behind her. Sarah didn't turn to look, too focused on maintaining her composure and reaching her destination, but she could feel the shift in the crowd's attention like a change in the wind. Jack Morrison emerged from the shadows at the edge of the square, and if Sarah's entrance had caused a stir, his appearance created something approaching shock. He'd cleaned up for the occasion in a way that reminded people who'd forgotten that he'd once been considered one of the most eligible men in the territory. His dark suit was well-fitted and obviously expensive, his boots polished to a mirror. Shine, and his hair combed back in a style that emphasized the strong lines of his face, but it was the look in his eyes that stopped conversations mid-sentence, the focused intensity of a man who knew exactly what he wanted and was prepared to fight for it. His gaze found Sarah immediately, drawn to her like a compass needle finding true north, and the expression that crossed his features was one of pure, undisguised admiration. The crowd seemed to hold its collective breath as two of Cedar Ridge's most talked-about residents stood at opposite edges of the town square, their eyes locked across the distance that separated them. Neither moved for a long moment, each perhaps weighing the cost of what would happen next, the public nature of whatever declaration was about to unfold. Then Jack began to walk forward, his steps as measured and deliberate as Sarah's had been, his eyes never leaving her face. The crowd parted for him as it had for her, creating two clear paths that were about to converge in the center of Cedar Ridge's most public space, under the eyes of everyone who had ever judged either of them for daring to hope for more than the town thought they deserved. They met in the center of the town square, as if drawn by invisible threads, the crowd forming a loose circle around them with the unconscious choreography of people witnessing something momentous. Jack stopped 3 feet from Sarah, close enough to see the golden flecks in her eyes, but far enough away to speak without the entire conversation becoming an intimate whisper. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the desert air, "you look beautiful." A ripple went through the crowd at the simple declaration, some people shocked by his directness, others by the obvious sincerity in his tone. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she held his gaze steadily. "Mr. Morrison," she replied, her voice carefully neutral despite the turmoil in her heart. "I didn't expect to see you here. I came because I had something to say," Jack said, his hand moving to his jacket pocket. "Something I should have said days ago, but I was too much of a fool to find the right words." The golden locket emerged from his pocket, catching the lantern light like a small sun in his palm. It was a beautiful piece, clearly an heirloom, with delicate engraving around the edges and a small diamond at its center that sparkled like a captured star. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that they were witnessing something significant. Something that would be talked about for years to come. "This belonged to my mother," Jack said, his voice steady but loud enough for everyone to hear. "And her mother before that. It's been passed down through 3 generations of Morrison women, each one strong enough to face whatever life handed her with dignity and grace." Sarah's eyes moved from the locket to Jack's face, confusion and hope warring in her expression. She was acutely aware of the watching crowd, of Mrs. Fletcher's sharp intake of breath, and Mrs. Morrison's shocked whisper, of the way even the children had stopped their playing to stare at this unexpected drama unfolding in their midst. "I know what you saw in that photograph," Jack continued, taking a step closer. "I know what you think it means. But you're wrong, Sarah. You're wrong about everything." "Jack, please," Sarah whispered, glancing around at the circle of faces surrounding them. "Not here. Not like this." "Yes, here," Jack said firmly, "because these people need to hear this as much as you do. They need to understand what they've been too blind to see." He raised his voice, addressing not just Sarah, but the entire crowd that had gathered to witness their confrontation. "This woman," he said, gesturing towards Sarah with the hand that held the locket, "is the finest person I've ever known. She's skilled and intelligent and stronger than any of you have ever given her credit for. She's shown more grace under pressure than most soldiers I served with, and she's faced down cruelty that would have broken lesser people." Mrs. Fletcher started to speak, her face flushed with indignation, but Jack's commanding voice cut through her protest. "She's also the woman I love," he declared, his words ringing across the square like a bell. "Not because she reminds me of anyone else, not because I feel sorry for her, and not because I can't tell the difference between the past and the present. I love her because she's Sarah May Collins, and there's never been anyone like her in this world." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of wind through the cottonwoods and the soft nickering of horses tied at the hitching posts around the square's perimeter. Sarah stared at Jack as if she'd never seen him before, her walking stick gripping tightly in her hand, her free hand pressed to her heart as if to keep it from beating right out of her chest. "Elena had a withered arm," Jack continued, his voice gentler now, but still carrying to every corner of the square. "She was brave and beautiful, and taught me to see past surface appearances to the person underneath. But that doesn't mean every woman I meet is just a reminder of her. Sarah is her own person, with her own strength, her own beauty, her own way of making the world better just by being in it." He stepped closer, now within arm's reach, and held out the locket like an offering. "I'm asking you to marry me, Sarah May Collins, not because you're like someone else, but because you're exactly who you are. I'm asking you to wear my family's locket and take my name, and let me spend the rest of my life proving that you deserve to be loved completely and without reservation." The crowd seemed to lean forward as one, waiting for Sarah's response to this public declaration that had just rewritten everything they thought they knew about both the hermit rancher and the town's most marginalized resident. Someone's sharp intake of breath was audible in the silence, and Sarah could feel the weight of every gaze like a physical presence. "Jack," she whispered, tears streaming down her face as she finally understood that his love was real, was hers, was everything she'd dreamed of but never dared to believe possible. Yes, yes, of course, yes. The golden locket changed hands like a promise being sealed, and as Jack fastened it around Sarah's neck with hands that trembled only slightly, the crowd erupted in a mixture of cheers, gasps, and heated whispers that would fuel Cedar Ridge's gossip mills for months to come. The deed to their new ranch in Colorado lay spread across the kitchen table, its official stamps and careful penmanship representing far more than a simple land transaction. Jack traced the boundaries marked on the accompanying map with his finger, following the lines that enclosed 200 acres of mountain meadows and pine forests, where they would build their new life together, far from the narrow judgments of Cedar Ridge. 6 months had passed since that pivotal night at the Harvest Festival, 6 months that had transformed both their lives in ways neither could have imagined. They'd been married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the ranch, with old Tom Garrett serving as witness and Mrs. Henderson providing a cake that she'd decorated with wildflowers from the creek where Jack and Sarah had spent so many afternoons, falling in love. Not everyone in Cedar Ridge had celebrated their union. Mrs. Fletcher had declared it an abomination of God's natural order, while Mrs. Morrison had predicted disaster for any marriage built on such unnatural foundations. But their harsh voices had been balanced by others, surprising voices that had spoken up in defense of the couple's right to find happiness together. Dr. Stevens, who'd kept his opinions to himself for years, had publicly stated that he'd never seen two people better suited to care for each other's needs. 3 of the younger women in town had quietly asked Sarah for sewing lessons, having recognized that skill and character mattered more than social standing. Even Mayor Hutchins had grudgingly admitted that Jack Morrison was a man of substance, who deserved respect for his choices. The decision to leave Arizona had come gradually, born from a shared desire to start fresh in a place where their story could be written without the weight of old prejudices. Sarah's sewing skills were portable, and Jack's experience with horses would serve them well in Colorado's ranching country. More importantly, they'd heard that the mining towns of the Colorado Territory were hungry for skilled craftspeople and had little patience for the kind of social hierarchies that had made their early courtship so difficult. "The house site looks perfect," Sarah said, studying the surveyor's notes that accompanied the deed. "Near the creek, but high enough to avoid flooding, with good southern exposure for gardens." Jack nodded, his arm tightening around her waist, as they stood together, examining their future. Pine trees for windbreaks, good grazing for horses, and close enough to Leadville for you to have customers, but far enough out for privacy. They'd learned to value privacy in these past months, finding that their happiness was best protected from the scrutiny of people who couldn't understand what they saw in each other. The ranch had become their sanctuary, a place where Sarah's laughter could ring freely and Jack's smiles came easily, where they could simply be husband and wife without constantly defending their right to that simple joy. Sarah's business had actually grown since their marriage, though not without some initial setbacks. Mrs. Carmichael had made good on her threat to warn decent people about employing Sarah's services, but her efforts had backfired when several women had decided to see for themselves what all the fuss was about. Sarah's skill spoke for itself. And soon she had more work than she could handle, including commissions from women in neighboring towns who'd heard about the seamstress who could make magic with needle and thread. Jack had expanded his horse operation. As well, breeding and training animals that were sought after throughout the territory. His reputation for fair dealing and quality stock had spread beyond Cedar Ridge, bringing buyers from as far away as California. The success had given them the financial security to make their move to Colorado to purchase land and stock it properly. From the beginning, but perhaps more importantly, it had proven to both of them that their worth wasn't dependent on the approval of people who'd never bothered to look beyond surface appearances. They'd built something valuable together, had created prosperity through their own efforts and mutual support. The evening before their departure, they'd held a small gathering at the ranch for the few people in Cedar Ridge who'd shown them genuine friendship. Tom Garrett had come, of course, along with Mrs. Henderson and Dr. Stevens. To everyone's surprise, Mayor Hutchins had appeared as well, bringing a bottle of good whiskey and an admission that he'd misjudged them both. Takes courage to build. Something real in this world, he'd said, raising his glass in toast. Takes even more courage to know when it's time to start over somewhere new. Now, as they prepared for their final night in the house, where they'd learned to love each other, Sarah fingered the golden locket that had become as much a part of her as her walking stick. Inside, Jack had placed a tiny photograph of them together. On their wedding day, her face radiant with joy, and his open with the kind of happiness that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. "Do you ever regret leaving Cedar Ridge?" Jack asked, as they watched the sun set behind the mountains that had witnessed their entire courtship. Sarah considered the question seriously, as she did most things. "I regret the years I spent believing what they told me about my worth," she said finally, "but I don't regret anything that led me to you. Even the painful parts taught me to recognize real love when I found it." Jack's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of a couple who'd learned to trust in each other's constancy. "Colorado will be different," he said. "We'll be different there." "We're already different," Sarah replied, smiling at him with the confidence of a woman who'd discovered her own beauty, reflected in the eyes of someone who loved her completely. "We just needed the courage to show it." The next morning, they loaded their wagon with the possessions that mattered most. Sarah's sewing machine, Jack's tools, the repaired music box that still played Elena's lullaby as a blessing over their new beginning, and the deed that represented all their hopes for the future. As they drove away from Cedar Ridge, neither looked back at the town that had tried so hard to convince them they didn't deserve happiness. Instead, they looked ahead toward the mountains of Colorado, toward a place where they could write their own story without asking anyone's permission, where love would be measured not by the opinions of others, but by the simple truth of two hearts that had found their perfect match in each other's courage.